At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Ron Vogt. Ron is the Government Contracts Counsel for Honeywell. Ron, take it away.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for some of you in your time zones. I happen to be in the Phoenix time zone, so I'm still in the morning, but I understand most of you are in Central or East. So whatever time of day it is, welcome. And I want to just give you a quick overview of what we want to cover in this seminar, and more importantly, what we're not going to cover. First of all, as you can see from our second slide here, we're going to talk about the U.S. government requirements that come into play whenever U.S. government money touches your project in any way. And that can be in a variety of ways. It can be either when the U.S. government itself is the customer, they're the project owner, or it can be where they've provided funding to your project through a variety of means. So your actual customer might be a state or local government, it might be a school district, it might be an office building owned by some government entity, whether state, federal, or local. We're also going to cover some of the requirements, the major requirements that will apply when there's U.S. government money involved. And the main requirements we're going to cover here are basically the manufacturing requirements and the content requirements, basically the things that tell you where your products must be made and what they can be made of. And finally, and most importantly, we're going to cover how to respond to these requirements. Now, what we're not going to be able to do here is make all of you experts in the Buy American Act, the Trade Agreements Act, the Recovery Act, and various acts and laws. The goal here is not to make you instant experts in that. Rather, it's just to give you an overview so you recognize what the issues are and you know how to respond, and also understand how Honeywell can help you respond to those requirements. Also, another limitation is we are limiting this presentation to fire system projects. Now, there are a couple of unique rules that do apply to fire system projects, which we're going to cover later in the presentation, but they do not apply to every situation. So please don't take some of the lessons we're going to give you here and apply it to a different scenario. Please understand that the things we're going to cover and the rules that we cover only apply to these scenarios that we're covering, and it could get you in some very serious compliance trouble if you try to apply them to other situations. So there are different rules for other types of projects and other types of products. So please understand that and don't carry this over into things that they don't apply to. So here's the basic situation we're trying to cover. You got a project and you have a customer that comes to you with some sort of compliance or certification request. And it comes in a lot of forms, but typically what we see is they come to you, your customer comes to you and says, hey, this is a Recovery Act project, or this got U.S. government money. I need you to give me a Buy American certificate, or I need you to certify that you're compliant with the Buy American Act or the Recovery Act or something. So there's a lot of variations of what you could see from your customer, but it boils down into those basic requests. They either want some sort of certificate from you saying you comply with something, or they want some sort of confirmation from you or a compliance certificate saying that you comply with something. So what do you do? Is the customer right? Are they asking for the right thing? If you give it to them, are you completely safe? Well, that's the object of this seminar. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next slide. There we go. The first thing we're going to do is give you just a little bit of an overview of what the basic landscape is that you're dealing with out there. What happens when there's U.S. government money involved in a project? How does it reach it, and why are these requirements there in the first place? We're just going to give you a little bit of information here, not too much detail to bore you all, but just enough so you understand the context of what we're dealing with. First of all, the source of all the problems here, in more ways than one, is Congress. They're the ones that come up with the money. And as you can see from the branches on this chart, that money can reach your project in a variety of ways. First, if you go down that central branch, it can reach your project when the federal agency itself is the purchaser. So that's when a federal agency is the project owner. It could be anything from a military base, it could be an IRS building, it could be a Department of Justice courthouse, it could be a Health and Human Services building, a Department of Homeland Security. It could be Like I said, it could be a variety of types of buildings. It could be military barracks or bases. It could be regular office buildings that a government agency is residing in. Nevertheless, the common theme there is that the U.S. government is the actual owner. Now, if you look off to the right branch, another way that funds reach your project is through federal agency funding. The government, the U.S. government, through a variety of programs, gives money out to state and local governments, local agencies. It can even give it out to private businesses. For example, individual corporations can apply for and receive grants from the federal government to do various things. Now, the red boxes underneath that branch represent some of the main givers of money, main funders of projects. We have the Federal Transit Administration, the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture. They're some of the primary sources of money that can reach your projects. Now, if you jump over to the left, we have another source of funds, and this is sort of an umbrella source, because through the Recovery Act, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the Recovery Act that was passed in 2009, through that, money was made available for both of those other branches. Money was made available to federal agencies themselves to spend on themselves, spend on their own projects. So Recovery Act money went to federal agency purchases, but Recovery Act money also went to other federal agencies to supplement or add to the programs that they already had in existence. So Recovery Act money went to the Department of Energy, the EPA, the Federal Transit Administration to add to or supplement their existing programs. The complication that happened here is that the Recovery Act added an additional layer of requirements on top of the strings that already come attached to the federal project or the federal funding. So let's move on to slide number 3 you should be able to see on your screens, and talk a little bit about the strings that come attached with money. Basically, when you're dealing with federal government funding, the law that provided that money comes with a variety of requirements. It can be requirements as to how the money is used, and for the purposes of this webinar this morning, they all come with some sort of Buy American type requirement. They do differ by agency, and we're going to get into some of those differences a little bit later, but the main thing to know here is that most of this funding comes with some sort of requirement as to where the products need to come from, and in some cases, what the content of the product needs to be as well. In other words, does it need to have at least 50% U.S. content, 60% U.S. content, something like that. So with that in mind, that's our basic overview of not only how federal money reaches your projects, but what kinds of strings come attached with those projects. Now, I don't have a question slide here, but if anybody does have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box, and David will give it out to the rest of us. And if there haven't been any questions, let's move on to the next topic, which is the main topic this morning, and that is the manufacturing and content requirements or restrictions, depending on what your perspective is on looking at these. Okay, first of all, where do these come from? Where do these various manufacturing type requirements come from? Well, as you can see from this slide, there are a variety of laws that create them. They all originate in Congress, and they all apply in different ways to your projects. But basically, collectively, these manufacturing and content requirements are the laws that dictate where your products can be made, and in some cases, what they have to be made of, their content. Some of these laws apply when the U.S. government is the purchaser. So, for example, you see from the top bullet, the Buy American Act only applies when the U.S. government itself is the purchaser. You look at the third bullet, there's something called the Trade Agreements Act. Again, that only applies when the U.S. government is the purchaser. You look at a couple of the other bullets, for example, the second one, the Buy America Act, to distinguish it from the Buy American Act above it. The Buy America Act applies to projects funded by the Federal Transit Administration. And then you go further down, you have the Buy American provisions in the Recovery Act, and you have some other laws that apply manufacturing or content type restrictions. We have those that apply to the Federal Transit Administration. We've got the FAA and its Airport Improvements Act. But collectively, all of these laws impose some sort of requirement on the use of the money and on where the products that that money pays for need to be manufactured. Now, as this slide says, how many different MCR type rules are there? How many manufacturing rules are there? Well, this is a little bit of an eyesore here, but this chart tries to break down the different variations that there can be in these laws. Each of the red boxes represents a variable. It's something that applies a different factor and could lead to a different type of rule. So, for example, if you look at the top left, the end customer is one variable. Most U.S. government agencies follow one set of rules. The Department of Defense adds its own little variation to the rules, and sometimes state or local governments have their own content type requirements. So you can see that variable there, who the end customer is, can lead to different rules for your project. Now, if you look over to the upper right, the type of contract. The type of contract can also lead to some variations in the type of rule you need to follow. So, for example, if you're dealing with the federal government, if it's a construction contract, one type of rule might apply, and if it's a supply contract, another type might apply. Moving down the middle left, the source of funds is another variable. If it came through normal appropriations and it's a U.S. government purchase, it's going to follow the federal acquisition regulations, so those rules will apply. If it's an ARRA-funded project, ARRA rules will apply, and so on. I'm not going to go over all these things, but the point is just to let you know that each of those red boxes is a variable, and underneath that variable, you can branch off into different rules. And if you remember your, I forget which math this came in, algebra or geometry or something, but if you remember permutations and variations where if you have two possibilities and then each of those can branch off into three possibilities and each of those can branch off into 3 or 4 more, well, if you multiply them all out, the conclusion you reach is that there are probably dozens of possibilities of rules out there depending on all of these variables. Now, is there any hope of making sense of all that? Yes, there is. Basically, no matter what path you follow in all of those rules, it leads you to just four possible variations in where your products can be made. And those variations are listed on the left here. First of all, the main and the most strict rule that you can run into is the Buy American Act. And under that, if that applies to your project, then your product would have to be made in the U.S. and 50% of its content would have to be made in the U.S. as well. That means 50% of the components and parts that you buy to make that thing would have to be made in the U.S. as well. Now, moving down to the second bullet, another requirement you might have to meet is that the product would have to be manufactured in the U.S., but the content would be irrelevant. That means as long as you make the product in a factory in the U.S. and it meets whatever manufacturing test applies, as long as it's manufactured in the U.S., then it doesn't matter where the components came from. Now, moving further down the strictness test, we hit the third bullet. Another rule that might apply is that the product you deliver would have to be made in a trade agreement country, and again, the content would be irrelevant. So that means that if that rule applies, your product could be made in the appropriate country that we have a trade agreement with, and again, the content of it, the parts and components, would not matter. And finally, the fourth, moving down the ladder of strictness in tests, if this happens to apply, your product could be made anywhere. So there are some situations where your particular product could be made in any country, including non-trade agreement countries. So those are the four main variations of the manufacturing and content rules that you're going to run into. So despite all of the variations and permutations on the earlier page, when you follow the path of all of those possibilities, they will lead to one of these four end results. Now, a couple of things to watch out for. Sometimes it's not clear what product this test will get applied to. So we do have to fully analyze the rules for that particular agency or project to find out what the product gets applied to, or rather what product the test gets applied to. So, what have we learned so far? Well, first of all, and the main thing is, there is no single rule that will apply to your particular product. Basically, the rule of thumb here is that a product that might be acceptable on one project might not be on another. So it all depends on the particular situation that applies to your particular project. Who's the end customer? Where did the funds come from? Once we know those things, we can tell you whether that particular product will be acceptable on that project. But the rule to take away here is that you can't just look at a product and say, oh, that one's going to be acceptable on any project. We need to know the project first before we can say that product is acceptable. There is one category of product that will be acceptable in any situation, and the reason for that is because if it meets the most stringent test, then you know it can be used on any project. And that kind of product is going to be one that meets the Buy American Act test. And that is a product that is both manufactured in the U.S. and has at least 50% U.S. content. If we know that a product meets that test, we can safely say that it can be used in any situation. That's the only time where you can say in advance that that product will be good anywhere. So that leads down to our basic question here, and that is, how the heck do you know what you can deliver on any particular project? And that leads to the next part of our presentation here, which will focus on the Recovery Act, or ARRA as it's known, and the Buy America Act, or rather, I'm sorry, the Buy American Act. And we're going to try to answer that question is, how do you know what you can deliver on any sort of project? So before we move on and focus on the Recovery Act and the Buy American Act, let's take a break there for any questions on what I've gone over so far.
We do have a couple questions, Ron. The first question that's posted is, does Honeywell provide the certificate of compliance for Buy American projects?
Yes, we can do that, but as you'll see as we get along in the presentation, there's a couple of things we need to know before we can provide that certificate. Basically, we need to know exactly what the requirements are for that project so that we can say either yes, our products comply with the Buy American Act or the Recovery Act or whatever's needed. So yes, we will provide it, but we are going to need to get some information from you about the project so we know exactly what we need to comply with for that project.
Okay. Second question is, for the 50% content in the U.S., is that a dollar value or some other measure?
Very good question. That's a cost test, and it's measured from the perspective of the factory. I call it a shopping list test. So if you are producing or manufacturing the product that needs to comply with that test, you look at it from your perspective. What was the cost of all the components and parts that you needed to buy to make that product, make that thing that's coming off the end of your assembly line, and what was your acquisition cost of those? So you look at, basically you're going to make two columns. One would be for all the parts and components that you had to buy that were made in the U.S. The other column would be all the parts and components you bought that were made outside the U.S. If the U.S. made column is larger than the non-U.S. made column, then you met the 50% test. So again, it's a shopping list test from the factory perspective.
Okay.
Did that adequately answer it, or did I jumble it up there?
No, I think so. So if the attendee that asked that, if they have any more questions, please post it using the chat feature. Next question, the question is, what technically is a product? And they go on to say, would a fire sprinkler system be considered a product even though it is made up of several subparts?
Again, a good question, but we are going to answer that in the sections that are coming up. So hold tight, we will get to that.
Very good. Okay, why don't we get back to your presentation and we'll answer other questions at the next break.
Okay, now we're on the Recovery Act, which is something that you have all had to deal with for the past couple of years, and you will continue to have to deal with it for at least another couple of years, because even though the money is expiring sometime soon, not all of the contracts or not all of the projects that got funded by it have let out all of their contracts. And even on those projects that have let out their contracts, they're still dealing with subcontractors and lower tier contracts. So we will see Recovery Act problems for probably at least the next year, if not longer. Not only that, but once Congress sees something good, they can't let go of it. So I will expect to see Buy American type requirements in future funding and appropriation acts as well. So let's talk about the Buy American Act. This is the language from the Buy American Act that is causing all the problems. And it's had two major impacts to us in the project community. First of all, the direct requirement, compliance with the Buy American provisions here itself. What does it take to comply with them? What do they mean? The second impact is indirect, but nevertheless it has had a very real impact on us. And that is that the Recovery Act and this Buy American provision in it has increased the attention to and the scrutiny that is being given to some of the earlier Buy American type requirements that existed, but everybody kind of glossed over or just ignored. It has increased the level of scrutiny that these Buy American type provisions put on various projects, and as a result, we are seeing this being paid attention to in non-Recovery Act projects as well. So thank you, Recovery Act, for increasing the scrutiny across the board on all sorts of government-funded projects. All right, we're going to talk about just a couple of the key concepts in the Recovery Act. If you notice from that first bullet, it applies to construction of a public work, and each of those terms is important. First of all, it applies to a construction project. If you happen to be providing simply spares or replacement items on a project, that might not qualify as construction. And if so, the Buy American requirement might not apply. Now again, this is something that we don't expect you to analyze, but if you want to forward that kind of question to us, we'll be glad to take a look at it and give you an opinion as to whether it is construction and whether the Buy American requirement would apply. And if necessary, we'll communicate with your customer to try to iron that out. Second of all, it only applies to a public work. Now, a public work is generally something that is owned by some sort of governmental entity, whether it's federal, state, local, school district, county, something like that. We have had some projects where Recovery Act money went to a corporation. For example, I believe Intel got a lot of Recovery Act money to fund some of their expansion projects. And as you know, there were a lot of those green energy type projects like Cylinder and some other things that got Recovery Act money. Those probably do not qualify as public works, and so the Buy American requirement might not have applied to those. Again, we don't expect you to analyze these things yourself, but by passing on the relevant information about the project, we'll help analyze it and decide whether or not the Buy American requirement even applies to it. Now, a manufactured good. The requirement applies to what the Recovery Act calls a manufactured good. So here's our first response to that question about what product does it apply to. For the Recovery Act, a manufactured good is the thing that gets installed in the project. It's each individual item that separately gets installed. So when we're talking about a fire alarm system, unfortunately, it does not apply to the system as a whole, despite the fact that they may be tied together by wires or wireless or whatever, or they have to operate together. For the Recovery Act, this requirement applies to each individual item that is brought to the site and then incorporated individually into the project. So in most cases, most of the individual parts, whether it's a strobe, a detector, a panel, most individual parts, if they are brought individually to the project and separately installed, any Buy American requirement would apply to each of those. Now the test is, where is it produced, manufactured, or substantially transformed? I use all those terms because a lot of times the customers you run into will use them interchangeably, but they all basically mean the same thing. Where was that thing made? Where did it become the item that is being installed? the main thing to watch out for there is if you want to say it was made in the U.S., enough had to happen in the U.S. that you can say it was made or substantially transformed in the U.S. Just to give you a rough example of something that would not qualify, if you have a product where basically the guts of the product was made somewhere else, like in Mexico, and you simply brought it here and put it in a housing or a case, that process step here of putting it in a housing or a case is not sufficient to call that product manufactured in the U.S. Just to give you a good example, if you have a thermostat, for example, and the circuit board and the working guts of the thermostat are made in Mexico, you import it here and you put it inside a plastic housing, you cannot call that thing made in the U.S. because the functioning product was actually made in Mexico, not here. Now, let's not spend a lot of time on that because Honeywell will give you a certificate of origin for all the products we're concerned with. So we're going to concern ourselves with that origin test, with that test of where something is manufactured, and we'll tell you where those products are made and whether it met any manufacturing or substantial transformation test. So let's move on to the next slide with some more key concepts. One very important concept here is under the Recovery Act, there is no origin test for the components. The test is where the end product was made, the manufactured product. A couple of other key concepts. There is an exception written into the Recovery Act for trade agreements, and that is when a project is over a certain dollar value, it is possible that products from trade agreement countries will be allowed as well. However, a warning here, as you note at the bottom, this has very limited applicability under the Recovery Act. The reason is that most Recovery Act money that you're going to see on projects is going to state or local governments. And state or local governments are pretty limited in whether they follow the trade agreements and which agencies of theirs follow the trade agreements. I'm not going to go into the details, but let me just say that so far on all of the 100 or so Recovery Act projects I've seen, we've only seen one where a state was able to use this trade agreement exception here. So it's very limited, but again, we will help analyze that and see whether it applies to a particular project. This slide, nothing real important here, just to let you know that there are, just gives you an overview of some of the countries that do have trade agreements with the U.S. and some that do not. China and India being the main countries that we do a lot of manufacturing in, but we do not have trade agreements with. So here, getting back to that question of what has to comply, under the Recovery Act, it's every individual product that gets installed in a project. So as you can see there, if you install a strobe, if you install a sprinkler, if you install some sort of detector, if you install a panel, each of those are likely to be brought to the site as individual products and installed separately. And so under the Recovery Act, each would need to meet any sort of origin test. Now this slide does have a couple of exceptions. The main one is known as the non-availability exception. Now again, we're not trying to make you experts in how this applies. Honeywell will help analyze this and determine whether an exception applies. Just the key point I want to make here is that officially under the rules, these exceptions are supposed to be granted before the contract is even let out. And as you all know from your experience on project sites, that almost never happens. And in fact, sometimes you're not even selecting installers and subcontractors until after the prime contract has been awarded. So we do have to jump through a few hoops if we decide that we want to apply for an exception after the prime contract has been awarded, but we will help with that. A couple of factors here to look at in this exception. Basically, the rule is if a particular product is not available from any U.S. source, that means a comparable or a compliant product is not available from any U.S. source, then you can probably get a non-availability exception. Some of the factors get looked at as to whether a product is available. Is a comparable product technically that meets the specs and requirements? Is that made by a U.S. source? Is there a U.S.-made source that will comply integration-wise or compatibility with a pre-existing system? Those are some of the factors that we look at to see if whether there's a comparable U.S.-made product that can be substituted. Is there a system certification requirement? So, for example, if you're installing a notifier system, has that received some sort of certification or approval that would only apply if the listed products are used? In that case, if one of those listed products is made in Mexico and the system retains its certification only if that product by part number is used, then that may help support a non-availability waiver. The takeaway here is there is the possibility of a waiver or an exception for products that are not made in the U.S., but we will help you analyze that and write up a request for a waiver if it's called for. Okay, just a quick note on the manufacturing test, and basically what is the country of origin. The purpose of this is just to give you an overview of what things are being looked at when we're trying to decide what the country of origin is. Again, Honeywell will provide you with a country of origin certificate if you need it, so you don't need to make these decisions yourself. This just gives you an idea of what the things are that get looked at, what it takes to meet that test. So to wrap up our discussion of the Recovery Act, here's some of the bottom line takeaway. If a product is made in the U.S., in other words, if we can give you a country of origin certificate for a product, then for the Recovery Act, it's okay to use. Where its components came from don't matter. If you need to buy a product for your project or for the system, and some of the products are not being made in the U.S., we might be able to apply for a waiver for it, or we might need to look for an alternate U.S.-made source for it. So either way, we'll help determine whether that applies and help walk you through that process so that you end up with products that will be fully compliant on your project. So that wraps up the discussion on the Recovery Act. And at this point, are there any questions on that?
Yeah, Ron, we do have a couple of questions. We've had the same question posed a couple different ways, so perhaps you can address it at this time.
Okay.
They know Honeywell is a large company, multiple divisions, multiple sales reps, so on. They're wondering who a go-to person would be or how they would start to determine whether it's a system sensor or a notifier, a couple manufacturers we've mentioned here, or another Honeywell affiliate. Who would they start with?
Start with your normal contact, whether it's a sales rep or marketing rep, whatever the name is, but start with the person that you normally deal with for Honeywell. And we should have already worked it out with all of the sales channels and all the marketing channels to bring these questions forward. Ultimately, most are probably going to reach me, but start with the person that you normally communicate and interface with in Honeywell.
Okay. All right. And then they would be that liaison to get the second kind of series of questions that have been asked by attendees too is that whole certificate or documentation. Is there anything that they can be preemptive on? A couple questions posed around that. So if they're using a notifier panel or they're using a system sensor device or another Honeywell company, can that be a preemptive, we've already got this from the manufacturer, we're locked in, here's the documentation, or is it always project-based?
That question comes up a lot, and we have struggled with that issue because we would like to be able to do something across the board as well that satisfies a lot of these kinds of requests you get from the customer. The problem is a lot of times what the customer asks for is either unclear or may not even be the right thing. So for example, on a lot of Recovery Act projects, we have had customers say, hey, give me a Buy American Act certificate. Well, the Buy American Act does not apply to the Recovery Act and, in fact, has no connection to it. So we've reviewed this several times, and the conclusion we've come to is that it's dangerous just to have pre-prepared certificates out there that somebody can just throw back at a customer whenever it's asked for, because it might be the wrong one, it might be the wrong compliance standard. So even though it means extra work, we do prefer to at least look at the project parameters first and decide what applies and then give you what you need. Believe me, we are looking for ways to streamline this, and anytime we can come up with a way to give something in advance to our field reps or sales reps out there, we will do that. But for right now, the only conclusion we've come to is that we do need to look at these on a project-by-project basis.
Okay. And as you mentioned earlier, that source of funding is one of the critical aspects, right?
That's definitely one of them, and also who the end customer is. Is it the U.S. government itself buying the products? Is it their project? Or is it a state or a local or some other customer that just got U.S. funds?
Okay. Interesting question here. I haven't seen this one posted previously. They're wondering about when the engineering and design work is actually completed outside of the U.S., how does that impact the overall project?
Oh, very interesting. And fortunately, it has an answer. The Buy American provisions in the Recovery Act is strictly a product-based requirement. So it applies to the hardware, the manufactured good, the thing that applies. So you could have designed it entirely outside the U.S., but the key is, where was the physical thing made? Now, some of the design work might be a factor in deciding whether that product was substantially transformed in the U.S., but you don't need to worry about that. For your purposes, this idea of manufacturing or substantial transformation applies to the physical product, the thing that's getting installed in the project.
Okay, all right. They say you mentioned the term made in America, and they're wondering about the use or the context. Is it in context to the FTC, or is it a general term you're using?
Made in America or made in the USA, the question is correct. Those are terms that are applied by the FTC. That's another whole problem area that I don't want to get into for this seminar, but that applies to the use of just the terms made in the U.S. or made in America. And those are basically labeling requirements. And the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, does have jurisdiction over those. That is yet another set of rules and tests. So if the question is, can we use the term made in the USA or made in America in our on a label on the product or in our advertising materials or in a brochure or something like that, those standards and the FTC standards are different from the Buy American Act standards or the Recovery Act standards. So again, that's a can of worms I don't want to get into here, but just be aware that there is yet another set of criteria that applies to using those labels and those terms both on your product and in your advertising and marketing. Okay. So what we're focusing on here is strictly the Buy American Act and the Recovery Act on the physical product.
Very good. For sake of time here, why don't we get back to your presentation and we'll handle more questions at the next break.
Okay. The Buy American Act. Now, the Buy American Act, which you've all heard of, and unfortunately the term gets misused anytime there's sort of a Buy American type requirement, but the Buy American Act actually has fairly limited applicability. If you jump right down to the red at the bottom there, you see that it only applies to a contract by the federal government, a purchase by the federal government, not something that the federal government funded through grants, loans, financial assistance, or any other means. The Buy American Act actually is probably the grandfather of these manufacturing and content requirements. It goes back to the 30s and was actually passed during the Depression. The whole idea was to save and create jobs for American workers. Where have we heard that term before? The Buy American Act does have separate provisions that apply to supply contracts and construction. So again, that goes back to that issue of some of the parameters that we need to know about a project before we can answer what the requirements are. The Buy American Act, and we're going to talk now about construction projects because that's the main situation that you all are going to find yourselves faced with. The Buy American Act applies to construction material. Now this is that question that was asked earlier about what product does it apply to. Does it apply to individual products or does it apply to systems as a whole? So when the Buy American Act applies, it applies to construction material, which is defined as the thing that is delivered to the project and installed or incorporated into the project by any supplier at any tier. So the key here is, no matter how far down the supply chain the supplier is, if that product is brought to the project and separately installed or incorporated into the project, then this Buy American Act requirement will apply. That's one of the key differences from a supply contract, because in a supply contract, the test only applies to the end item. So once you get below the prime contractor, there's limited applicability. On a construction project, though, it applies all the way down the chain if that product is brought to the site and installed. Now, what's the main test under the Buy American Act? This is that strictest test we were talking about earlier. It must be made in the U.S., manufactured in the U.S., and the cost of the components must, the cost of the U.S. made, the domestic components must exceed 50%. Now, I note that rule, that little sub-bullet down at the bottom about a COTS item. A COTS item is commercial off-the-shelf, and there is an exception in the rules that if an item is genuinely commercial off-the-shelf, meaning you're selling it to the federal government in the same form that you sell it to a commercial customer, no modifications, no changes, it's truly off-the-shelf, then it does not have to meet that component test. It only needs to meet the manufactured in the U.S. test. So under the Buy American Act, if your product must be what's known as domestic, then it must meet both of those tests. Now, just to give you an idea of some of the absurdities of the Buy American Act and how it applies, if you look at this chart here, on the left we have a product circled in green. It's a product that satisfactorily meets the domestic test. And as you can see, underneath it, the one block in red, the 35% block, that's a component that came from a foreign source, and the others, 25 and 40%, came from U.S. sources. So because 65% of the parts or components for that product came from the U.S., that thing is good. Now you look at the end product on the right, that one's no good because 25 plus 35, that's 60, I think. 60% of its components came from foreign sources and only 40 came from a U.S. source. So that one did not meet the 50% U.S. content test. Now what's absurd about it is you look over on the left, that domestic end product, the subcomponents under that 40 block there, all of the subcomponents of that came from foreign sources. All that happened up in that green block is that all of those foreign subcomponents were assembled or manufactured in the U.S., but that was enough to call that 40% there to say that that product was manufactured in the U.S. And so even though if you look at the total content of that product, if you look at the total, 40 plus 35%, that's 75% came from foreign sources, it still gets called a domestic end product even though it has more actual foreign content than that product on the right. So let's not get bogged down in that. That's just an example, but it shows you what some of the absurdities of these rules can lead to as a result. Okay. Under the Buy American Act, there's a couple of other factors which we're not going to dwell on here. They're just basically other exceptions and waivers that could apply in various scenarios. But for your purposes, for a fire alarm system, there is one main overall thing or rule that we need to be concerned with. Because when the federal government is the purchaser, you don't need to worry about what the definition of a construction material is. You don't need to worry about the exceptions. You don't need to worry about the waivers. And you don't need to worry about the Trade Agreements Act, because the federal government defines an emergency life safety system as a single item of construction material. This is great news. I would almost call it a loophole if a loophole didn't have such bad connotations to it. But in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, in the definition of construction material, not only does it define it as the item brought to the project, but it further says that an emergency life safety system gets treated as a single item of construction material, no matter how those separate parts are brought to the site and installed. Now, I don't know the history of that, how it got in there, how it became part of the definition. I'm assuming the fire alarm industry had good lobbyists. But for some reason, the entire system gets treated as one product. Now, what does that mean for you? It means that you got to engage in a little bit of a fiction. You have to kind of picture that entire building as being the factory where the end product, that fire alarm system, is manufactured. So all of those individual products now, instead of being separately installed, we've got a red circle around them to show that all of them together are one item of construction material. And the building where they're all put together, you can kind of look at that or think of that as the factory where they're assembled or manufactured. So there's the manufacturing test. Now you only have to meet the component test. So again, you look at that system as one product, and you look at all those individual things that go into it as the components. If at least 50% of those are manufactured in the U.S., you have met the full Buy American Act test. Now, for our purposes, for a Honeywell fire alarm system, most of the system sensor products are made in the U.S., and more importantly, most of the main components that come out of Notifier and Life Safety and the other major Honeywell fire alarm systems, most of those are made in Northford, Connecticut. When you put all of that together, it's probably safe to say that in most, if not all, of the Honeywell fire alarm systems that you would install, a majority, well over 50%, of the individual products will be made in the U.S., and therefore you will meet that 50% test for the components. Now, the big problem here is that even though I'm pretty confident that in most, if not all cases, you're going to meet that full Buy American Act test, the big issue you're going to face is one of education. The problem you're going to have is that the customers and the inspectors you're going to have on a project site are probably going to be thinking, Buy American, Buy American, Buy American. And all they're going to be thinking is everything needs to be made in the U.S. So what we've seen in a few cases is a project inspector goes on the site, sees a box labeled China, and says, hey, get that out of here. Buy American Act applies. Everything's got to be made in the U.S. So we got to do a little bit of customer education there. We've got to be able to get back to the customer and let them know why an individual part in a fire alarm system is okay, because the entire system needs to meet the test. Now, this is sort of a play-it-by-ear situation, because you don't want to unnecessarily irritate your customer or do things that will get you on the wrong side of them. So when something like that happens, we do want you to contact us and let us know, and we will analyze the project, make sure we understand what the right requirement is, and if necessary, we'll write something or communicate something to get back to the customer, let them know that that individual part is acceptable because it's part of the entire system. But this is a situation, like I said, that you kind of need to play by ear, because there's 100 different variations of that scenario that might come up. So at that point, that's our brief overview of the Buy American Act, and more importantly, how it applies to a fire alarm system. Now, recall back in the beginning of the seminar, we did say to be careful about applying these rules to any other projects. That's particularly important here when we're talking about this big definition for fire alarm systems. It only covers a fire alarm or another type of an emergency life safety system. So don't think that an HVAC system or something else might get the benefit of that system definition. So with that in mind, again, we'll take a break here for questions on the Buy American Act, and then we'll hit the next short segment of the webinar and wrap it up.
Very good. I do have a couple questions posted, Ron. Is there a database that's available on Buy American Act compliant components within either individual businesses or Honeywell as a master resource of that?
Again, for the reasons we mentioned earlier, we have not created a master database simply because I think it would be too complex. You would have to have columns for every type of requirement they might have to meet. So you'd have to have a column saying this product meets the Buy American Act, and then another one for Trade Agreements Act, and another one for the Buy American of the Recovery Act. And then you get into the issue of whether the individual product must meet the requirement or whether only the system does. So there's just way too many variables in there. We've looked at it and tried to figure out a way to do it, because believe me, we'd love a simpler way to do this. But I think it's just too risky to try to come up with one master database that answers everything.
Okay. A couple questions on the emergency life safety systems and the definition of that. Would that include, for example, CCTV, access control? Another question is relating to fire sprinkler systems versus that commercial fire system.
I think if it applies, if you're talking about anything that belongs to a fire system, I think those would all be included under the umbrella of an emergency life safety system. Access and security systems, a little more questionable. If your question specifically is about a project you have where you're installing just an access system or a security system or a monitoring system, I would say to bring that up individually through your sales rep and let's look at that. My first inclination is that that probably does not meet the emergency life safety system, but depending on the reason for the system and what function it's meant to accomplish, it might. But I'm not prepared to say across the board that it meets it at this point.
Okay, all right. Another question on the exact wording of the definition of one system. Where could they find that if they wanted to look that up themselves?
That is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and if you're familiar with working with that, it's in Part 25. Part 25 of the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, covers all of these foreign manufacturing requirements. And that definition is in the definition of construction material.
Okay, all right. Last question for this section, then I know you have a couple more slides here, and we're getting close to the top of the hour. What about the cost of labor in a system? Not the labor in a component manufacturing, but the labor that's provided by that installer on site.
Again, it's not a factor. Most of these manufacturing and content requirements relate only to the product itself. So if you're trying to look at that 50% domestic content test for the Buy American Act, your installation costs, your labor costs, and everything doesn't matter. It's strictly where was that product made. And the same thing actually would go into the test if you're looking at the factory. If you're applying the Buy American Act test to an individual product, that 50% content test only applies to the parts and components that you buy for it, not your own labor, your own engineering, your own testing, or whatever to carry out your factory processes. That's why I call it a shopping list test. If you were to go out and with a shopping list of the things you needed to buy to make your product, that's what the component test applies to.
Okay, very good. So why don't we go ahead and have the remainder of your presentation, Ron.
Okay, now to wrap it all up, what does it all mean for you? Well, first of all, as we said in the beginning, it can come up, these issues can come up in a variety of ways. Sometimes your customer just asks you for the origin of your products. Now that's generally okay, and in those cases we'll probably just give you a statement that lists the country of origin for each of the products that we're selling to you. And I say generally okay because there's a couple of danger points there to watch out for. If the customer is just asking for the origin, there's a little bit of risk that the customer might be doing his or her own analysis and deciding based on that some products are okay and some products are not. So even though the certificate itself will be accurate and you won't have a compliance problem just saying where it's made, there's a little bit of risk that the customer may look at it and say, okay, you can't use this one, can't use that one, don't deliver this, don't deliver that. So in that case, we would want a chance to help analyze the requirements, and we might need to go back to the customer and say, hey, this thing made in Mexico is actually okay in this case for the following reason. But again, just the simple statement of the origin of the product, we're glad to give that. We just need to make sure that it's being used and applied in the right way. Now, second possibility is your customer could ask you for a certificate of compliance, or they might ask for give me a Buy American Act certificate, or tell me you comply with this. Or they may just say, hey, I need you to certify that you comply with everything in this contract, or whatever. That's very risky because in too many cases that we have seen, they're either asking the wrong thing or applying a standard that is not accurate. So we do want the opportunity to analyze the project requirements, see exactly what the heck needs to be complied with, and then determine whether we can give you that sort of certificate. So for that, here's how Honeywell can help out. First of all, as I mentioned, we can tell you the origin of our products. No problem there. We don't need you to analyze that or anything. We'll tell you where they're made. We can also help with the analysis of a project to decide what the rules are. To do that, we need a couple of things from you. Conveniently, we've even come up with a form that asks these questions. And as you can see on that form there are 3 basic questions. In fact, let me back up here a second. The 3 bits of information that we need are who that end customer is, the top level one, not just your direct customer, but the project owner, where the money came from. Is this a government-owned project, or is it getting funds from somewhere? And it'd be helpful to know whether it's a Department of Energy program like their EERE program or EECBG program, or is it a Transit Administration project? And then total project value, because that might help us decide whether we cross that $7 million threshold. And if you fill out that form and send it back to us, we will look at that and we'll decide what the rule is that applies to that particular project. We'll tell you where the products have to be made. We'll help with a waiver if you need it. We can then put together the proper compliance certificate if you need that. And if we can see that the customer maybe is asking for the wrong thing, we'll help go back to the customer and trying to iron out any difficulties there. So with that in mind, we have reached the end of the formal presentation and not a minute too soon. So are there any more questions that apply to everything? There's a couple questions here that are asked by a couple folks, so we'll wrap up with those here. We'll answer a couple of them. What would be a realistic turnaround time within Honeywell? So the customer has a request, they're working with the right agency, they've got the forms. What do you think that turnaround time should be or would be? I wish I could give a definitive answer to that. We kind of prioritize them. If you've got an emergency on a project and your customer needs to know by that day, we'll try to meet it. If it's not immediate, I'd say within a few days we can turn that around. If it's a complex question that needs a lot of research, it might take a little longer. But the bottom line here is we'll meet your deadline. If it's something you need by tomorrow, we'll bump it up the queue and meet that. Okay. And a couple of questions here on where is the form? You mentioned the form, so would they get that from their rep, or would they find that online or contact you, or how would they get that? Oops, I gotta let that be answered by one of the sales reps or marketing reps or somebody in charge of communications there. I actually don't own that form. Somebody is going to need to distribute that. Okay. Sorry, I can't give a better answer there. That's right. They'd start with their sales rep then, I think, would be the appropriate response. Yes. A couple questions on will this webinar be available for archive? Yes, we mentioned that right at the start that we will post it online in 2 to 3 days, so if any of your colleagues did miss it, it will be available for replay and download. We know some people like to download it and show it to other groups, so that's available as well. So we're at the top of the hour, so I've got to call it to a close here on behalf of System Sensor. I do want to thank you for joining us today. As a follow-up, we will send you a brief survey in about an hour and would appreciate your help in filling that out. We do plan to reward one of you that completes the survey with a $50 Target gift card. Thank you for joining us today. This does conclude our webinar. Have a nice rest of the day.